Now, these next couple of questions, I found them really interesting, and I can't wait for Bishop to answer them. So this first one is, are family curses real? And if so, does the Catholic Church believe in that? So examples like some people might say, like, I'm having bad luck, generations after generations of maybe divorce, cheating, or anything. It must be a great-great-grandpa that made a curse on us. So,
okay, this is something I get a lot of people who ask about this.
Mm-hmm.
And even within certain circles in the Catholic Church, there are people who misunderstand this. And a key scripture passage that we need to go back to, that's really a foundation for the proper Christian understanding of this issue, is John chapter 9. It's the man born blind. They bring this man born blind to Jesus, and they say, Master, was this guy born blind because of his own sin or because of his parents' sin? And Jesus' answer is, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Now that is a key passage in trying to unravel all of these twisted ideas about family curses and generational problems, okay? We need to trust in that passage from John chapter 9. We need to trust in what happens in baptism. You need to trust in what happens in the sacrament of penance, confession, and you need to understand what it means to have human freedom in Jesus Christ. When you understand those things, it puts all this in the proper perspective. So first of all, our baptism frees us from the original sin that we inherited from Adam and Eve. When we baptize, when a person is baptized, we are freed from sin. And you have to trust in the reality of that. Mm-hmm. Trust in the reality of baptism. Because of our baptism, we live in the freedom of Jesus Christ. We're not slaves to somebody's sins in the past. The reason why we're not is because of the grace of our baptism. Our baptism has set us free from the sins of our ancestors. That's an essential Christian belief. Another thing is this whole idea of freedom. We are set free from sin and death by our baptism, so we are able to make free decisions. And now we suffer the effects of the sins of others. But that's different from saying that we are somehow bound by some spiritual curse. Mm-hmm. We suffer the negative effects of people's sins, just like we suffer the negative effect of our own sins. So what would be some of those negative effects of the sins of others that cause us suffering? Well, for example, we could learn bad habits. If my grandpa smoked and my dad smoked, I might smoke. Well, I'm suffering the negative effects of their decisions because I learned it from them. Mm-hmm. Or, for example, our families might repeat dysfunctional behaviors. Mm-hmm. For example, you might have had certain patterns of what you call triangulation in relationships in a family. And it's very unhealthy. And they pass that on to their children. They pass it on to their children because it's the way their families learn how to behave. Or, for example, a cutoff in a family, where a certain person in a family completely cuts themselves off from everybody in the family, and they never talk to them again and never see them again. That causes a woundedness to everybody in that family. And then that woundedness affects them emotionally, and that emotional problem can be passed on. But that's different from it being some sort of a spiritual chain that's binding you. Mm-hmm. Okay? It's an emotional wound. Or there are certain vices and sins that can be learned and passed on. Or think, for example, of the woundedness that people suffer from slavery. Okay? Think of the oppression, the message that black men in the United States received for generations when they were being enslaved. That can impact a culture. And so, today there are people who grew up in such a culture who might be suffering the impact of that sin, which was generations ago, because of the negative messages that were communicated to the people that were being oppressed. Mm-hmm. And now, that doesn't mean that you can't break free from it. You can break free from it. But we need to deal squarely with the long-term effects of sin, including individual sin and social sin. But that doesn't mean that it somehow is a curse. These are negative effects that are passed on through emotions and learned behaviors and learned messages that get taught from generation to generation. Those can be unlearned because we're free. We're set free by Jesus Christ. And so we need to keep that in mind. Also keep in mind what happens in confession. When we go to confession, we are forgiven. And we need to trust in that fact. You know, a lot of what's happening with stuff from the past is we're refusing to let go of our resentment about things from the past. We need to let go of the resentments, and we need to forgive, and we need to go to confession and be forgiven for what is our sin. It's really important to keep in mind that everybody has their own responsibility. So when there has been a painful situation in the past and I'm still suffering from it, I need to be able to sift through and distinguish between what in that situation was I responsible for and what in that situation were other people responsible for. They're responsible for their sins. I'm responsible for mine. I should not accept responsibility for somebody else's sins. You need to separate those things out. You and I are not bound by the sins of others. We are responsible for our own. We take those to confession and we are forgiven. And we need to trust in that grace, and we need to let go of our resentment for what other people have done to us.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you. Just shows how powerful the sacraments are and how much we need them. And I think this also ties into the next question. So this student asked, Bishop, can you explain soul ties? So for people out there that don't know what soul ties are, I had to look this up. Soul ties is basically when someone has sexual intercourse with somebody and a part of yourself will always be tied to that person.
Okay, now soul ties, I would say, is a pretty contemporary idea. It's not a biblical teaching. It's not part of the tradition of the Catholic faith. In fact, for example, when we talk about marriage, we say that in marriage, the husband and wife become one flesh. We don't say that the husband and wife become one soul. They become one flesh. And in the Bible, it talks about covenants. Covenants, agreements, pacts between different parties. And for example, human beings make covenants with one another. But those are earthly bonds. God makes a covenant with his people in the Old Testament. But the everlasting covenant is with Jesus Christ. That's the everlasting, eternal covenant that we celebrate in the Mass. So human bonds are not everlasting. For example, you marry somebody, you become one flesh with that person. But then, if your spouse dies, you can marry another. Because your soul has not become somehow enmeshed with the soul of your first spouse. And then they passed away. You became one flesh, but not one soul. You still have an intact soul. You can still marry somebody else and have a beautiful marriage. And so that's interesting to make those distinctions with covenants. And so human souls don't get somehow fused together or knitted together. There are real human experiences of connection between people. You've got friendship, attraction, affection, admiration. You have commitments. You have a team spirit. All of those things are beautiful, true, authentic human experiences. But they're not taking away our human freedom. And that's a key. Because if you had some sort of a soul tie, then your soul would be so enmeshed with that other person that you can't, that your freedom is limited. Okay? But you still have freedom. You still have the freedom to walk away from a human relationship or from a group that you've been a member of. And there are certain things that are human relationships that are unhealthy, like obsessions and fixations. Sometimes a person just becomes obsessed with another or fixated on another, and they don't want to let go. But because Christ gives us freedom, we can let go those obsessions and those fixations on another person. Sometimes when somebody has sex with somebody, they start to think, well, because I had sex with them, therefore I must marry them.
Mhm.
But that's not true. Just because somebody had sex with that person doesn't necessarily mean that they ought to marry them. That's a very different decision. Now, sexual intercourse creates an amazingly powerful bond between people, a very strong emotional connection, because that's a part of God's plan for the gift of marriage. God gave us the gift of sex to be used in committed marriage because it creates this amazingly strong bond.
Mhm.
And so many people have told me over the years that they had sex before marriage with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and then they split up. And they talk about how that hurt them so much. And the way that I envision that, just in a little image, is you take two pieces of construction paper and you glue them together. And then when you need to separate those two pieces of construction paper that were glued together, there's going to be some tearing.
Mhm.
The same thing happens to the human heart because there is such a strong physical, emotional bond that was formed by that sexual intercourse, that when that couple breaks up, it hurts. It hurts a lot. But the reason for that bond is because it's a part of God's plan for the gift of marriage.
Mhm.
That's why sex should be reserved for marriage.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you for that answer.